super excited to see her talk as well.
Hi all, good afternoon or good whatever, good morning everybody. And now I will share my screen, and sorry I was not able to record my presentation, but I hope that you will however like it. And so tell me if there is any problem if you don't see it, if you don't see the videos and these kind of things. So let's start. Probably I will be even a bit faster so to take back a few of the minutes that we lost. So this presentation will be about droplets research. And my name is Silvia Holler. It's not a live too as the Zoom says, but I was one of the organizers of this year live. This is why this strange name on Zoom. And I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Trento. So let's talk about droplets. What are droplets? When we mix two immiscible fluids, such for example oil and water, they remain in two different separated phases. And for example, things that we see every day in the daily life in the kitchen is that if you drop a drop of oil in water, it gets and it stays separated from the surrounding water. So what can we deduce from this thing? When we had the origin of life on Earth, we had different compounds present. Life was still not so complex as it is now, but we had, however, water that was present, and we had, however, oil that was present. So, but not only these things, such, for example, even amino acids, peptides, and nucleic acids, but speaking only about water and oil. Oil in water could produce different kind of aggregates that Emily already explained you earlier, such for example, droplets or vesicles. So droplets, for who is not of the topic, such for example, are aggregates when we have oil and even oil in the middle of the drop itself. Instead, the vesicles is one aggregate of lipids in which in the middle we have a water phase. And this water phase is surrounded by a monolayer or a bilayer of lipids or phospholipids. So, but what do these droplets have to deal with alive? Wait a second, I'm sorry, my presentation was not going on. So how are droplets related to alive? Droplets are related to alive because they can show life-like behaviors. So as already said before, this is a part of alive that is called wet alive. And yes, these kind of simple chemicals, so something that is really not living, if mixed together, can behave as not really human beings, but even plants, other things. And as you can see from this video, this kind of behavior are somehow like even artistic like and can change shape or color and different kind of things. But so let's describe better what are these kind of behaviors that droplets can show. So there are behaviors such as self-movement, self-division, individuality, group dynamics, and even intelligence, maybe. So let's start about the individuality and group dynamics that droplets could show. So maybe many of you already saw this work that is by Shinpei Tanaka, and it shows how these droplets of paraffin oil charged with ethyl salicylate in different quantities that can have a different percentage going from 70% to 90% and colored with red. So these droplets are the red points that you see in the middle of the Petri dishes. If charged inside a water phase in which there is even present SDS, so a surfactant, can behave in specific and particular ways. So, for example, we place the droplets inside the Petri dish and they arrange and they form circular structures that then collapse and rearrange in other structures. So, for example, you can see as in the first line, at the end we obtain a structure that is similar to one eye, and in the bottom one, instead of structure that, I don't know, we could say maybe similar to a snail or something like that. So I have even a video that Shinpei shared with me of these structures. And here you see that, for example, when the droplets are charged inside the Petri dish, and so when the system is taken out of equilibrium, the structures of the droplets start to form, to create. the droplets aggregate in this circular structure that then in a second time collapse and form other ones. Shinpei is not the only one person working on this kind of droplets. There are many groups working on them. Other videos that I would like to show now are the one from Richard Loeffler that already showed them at one of the previous conference of Half-Life. He worked too with paraffin oil droplets, and these paraffin oil droplets are charged instead of with ethyl salicylate with another compound that is reactive, that is instead camphor. So what happens to these droplets when they are placed in water? They change their shape. They oblongate, they become longer, and they try to fuse. Is there a question? I heard some noise. No, should be okay. I'll go on. So you can see how these droplets behave and show a shape change and the creation of this like tentacular from the sides. This is not the only kind of behavior that this kind of recipe can create. In fact, if the droplet is smaller and the percentage of colorant inside the droplet, so of oil redo, is higher, these other things can be created. So we start from a singular droplet, but then it tried to do a fission. But instead of doing a fission, it creates these filaments that spread all over the petri dish. And then you can see how they will continue to change their shape. And at the end, they will go towards one equilibrium in which instead of being tentacular, they will have all the shape of a circle. But these are not the only ones behavior that we can produce using this structure that are initially not living, but seems to have this behavior that is like the one of one living organism, one amoeba, one bacteria moving. So another example of these behaviors that are lifelike is the proportion. So there was this work that was of 2009 by Martin Ancic and even by Takashi Kigami that was present before, in which they showed that they can propel the oil droplets. These oil droplets are made of nitrobenzene and they are charged with a specific anhydride. When the anhydride is hydrolyzed on one specific side of this droplet, one convective flow is created inside the droplet itself, and the droplet is propelled and moved into the front, to its front, and it's leaving at this trailing edge one shadow of waste. This kind of things is not the only system that is self-propelled. In fact, for example, Taro Toyota showed this other self-propelled system inside which, at the trailing edge, instead of having created one shadow of waste, we have droplets that are created. And in the same way, the droplet in the front instead is propelled in towards its front. So this is not the only type of motion that this kind of objects can show. So this is, we could call it more like chemokinesis because it's more, let's say uncontrolled, but these droplets show even chemotaxis. So chemotaxis is a behavior that normally we can see in nature. Such, for example, this video is showing you how dictyostelium is moving towards a source of CAMP. At the same time as this other video made by Martin Ancic can show you, the oil droplet, that in this case is of decanol and it's blue, can follow a gradient of sodium permanganate that is created in its environment. There are many kind of 2D systems in which this kind of droplets can move. And as Itka said in this her paper, these droplets could be thought as liquids robots. At the end, as the robots, they are created from something that are non-living, but at the same time, they show some like living, some like behaviors that we see in the nature and in our everyday life by thinking humans or thinking animals. So, for example, the droplets can move in circular environment, in 2D environment, and they can move back and forward, but even in maze. So we could say that droplets are somehow intelligent because they can find, without knowing their end up point, the way to go home, as the D figure shows us. So this is, for example, a video of the work of Itka. So in this video, you can see this droplet of decanol in pink that is charged inside a 3D maze. At the same time, on the other part of the maze, of which the pink droplet doesn't know anything, is charged another droplet that is charged with salt. The salt creates one gradient that attracts the pink droplet. And as you can see, the pink droplet at the end, without at the beginning knowing anything about the end-up position in which the yellow droplet was placed, is able to reach it and fuse with it. So this system can be used not only in an intelligent way to solve mazes, but even to do one taxi-like effort. So for example, we can charge the droplet with some inorganic objects, not living, such as a copper wire, but we showed in this cited review that I made with Itka, that we showed even the transport of objects like a fly, like a piece of paper, or like a piece of plastic. And as you see from the video, the droplet is moving with itself, even the copper wire. But at the end, we have even able to destabilize the copper wire from its binding with the, yes, Itka. I saw your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Sorry, I wanted to make the hands up.
Okay, don't worry, no problem. So yeah, the droplet is not only able to do a taxi for the copper wire and to transport it, but even to, if destabilized by a specific solution with a lot of surfactant, to leave it in one specific place of the Petri dish that we choose. So these are not the only things that can be transported using a droplet. Using a droplet, we can transport even, for example, alginate capsules containing cells. These kind of cells can be, for example, yeast and bacteria, and that can be placed in a second point of our Petri dish, and they can even survive the transport. So as you can see the video, the droplets are moving, transporting the capsules, now are destabilized, and in the second movement, only the droplets are moved. This system is interesting because we are not simply able to transport this kind of bacteria, yeast cells, but even mammalian cells. So even mammalian cells can move. And the interesting thing of this system is that the cells inside the alginate capsules are releasing surfactants while being incubating inside the capsule. So releasing surfactants in their environment, they create one water phase that enables chemotaxis. At the same time, the alginate capsules can be retained and bind the droplet only if the cells are inside it and they release a surfactant. So we are somehow not simply coupling these two systems, but we are increasing its efficiency and the functions of the both two. So both of the cells and both of the chemotactic droplets. But this is not only the only approach to integrate the different systems. When we were at the origin of life environment, however, we had many other different elements that were increasing the system complexities, such as the thermal variation or such as other substances like nucleic acids or coacervates. So, for example, there was this paper that is under peer review that recently showed by Claudia Bonfio that when exposed to a specific heating and cooling ramp, the vesicles can change their shape, become droplets, and then re-become vesicles a new time. And in the meantime, they can mix both two lipids and even the content present inside them. At the same time, other labs, such as the one of Joe Buchanan, showed instead how coacervates of peptides can aggregate, and at the same time, they can aggregate too with mRNA. And this is maybe somehow interesting, such as in the last period due to COVID, there is a lot of interest on droplets, and droplets bind to mRNA, such as for the vaccine that is produced by Pfizer. So this system seems simple, can reproduce some a lot of behaviors that are lifelike, and going on with the time, they are becoming more and more complex, and more elements are integrated inside them. So this is, for example, another image that comes from the work I'm involved now inside the project ACDC, in which there are instead droplets that are tagged with DNA. So this is one example of another interaction between droplets, lipids, and nucleic acid. I think this is a really broad topic of wet alive, and it was really difficult to say enough thing and to produce some interest in 20 minutes. So I hope you enjoyed the talk, and we hope to see you even tomorrow.
Wonderful. Great job, Silvia. Thank you.
Yeah.
I've got time for some questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry if sometimes the videos were a bit slow, but they are heavy.
No, it's fine. They were beautiful.
A lot of colors. Yeah, and however, to remain at the topic, there were a lot of, I showed few works by Takashi and by Tano that were of like 10 years ago. They went on like in studying them and producing new kind of system, but really they published so many papers in the last 10 years that it was really difficult to me to decide what to show. I decided to show something that were like the more simple things, just to say if there are a person like coming from other areas of a life, at least they can somehow understand what I'm speaking about.
Yeah, that was the right way to go. Yeah, I mean, like trying to like summarize an entire subfield of A life in 20 minutes is a really hard task. You did a great job. Looks like we've got a question from Miley.
Yeah. Can droplets move down in a body of water? Yeah. I tried even to produce 3D systems. They can be produced, they can, for example, but you need like, most of the droplets that I use, for example, it's decanol. Decanol has a lower density than water, and so it stays on the water surface. But for example, if you mix it with chloroform, you can create a 3D system in which droplets is inside the water phase, and you can even move it inside the water phase too. So it's difficult to create neutrally buoyant droplets that can stay in the middle of a water phase. But if you're able to stabilize them, then all these systems that we showed you work even a 3D environment. Okay. Oh. Yeah, great, Anya. That I'm happy that you somehow understood more what these kind of oily things are.
Actually, I'm curious about your thoughts on Anya's question before her comment. She asked, are there people who worked on droplets that reproduce themselves, or is that kind of like farther down the road?
Yeah, there are even people working on it. So the main kind of reproduction that that they did research on is like having one system, for example, not only of droplets, as we talked about now, but for example, a lot of people work on vesicles. But I didn't speak about vesicles, so it would have been even more broad. But for example, if you have a system of vesicles and you introduce more lipids, even with some surfactant and other things, they are able to reproduce, and at the same time, you can create a different population afterwards with mixed compositions of lipids.
Cool,
yeah.
Thanks.
But even that, it's a really short answer. It's really a broad topic, so it's difficult to answer it fastly.
Looks like we got a question from Luis too.
Yeah, thinking about that. It would be nice to be able to predict the behavior of droplets. And for example, I was in a past European project in which we were trying to computing the chemotaxis of these droplets by really studying them. And it can be done. And I think so it can be broadened to a lot of things. And we could have a lot of computer-like droplet system. And the point is that, however, in biological life, there are always a lot of unexpected things happening. Such, for example, I don't know, in our experience, for example, from one moment to the other, their air conditioning goes up and you don't expect it, and it makes move your droplet in an unexpected way. And I think there is always something like hidden and not expected in real life happening. So I think there will be always somehow like a big difference from computer in biological system. Always a little bit of variation, let's say.
That's a fantastic answer. Sorry, can I just?
Yeah,
What
sure.
about the opposite? So do you think so computers are sort of doing computations that we dictated that are important, and we've set up the particular environment for the computer, right? And so do you view the kind of computation or the kind of behaviors that the droplets are doing similar to computers, or is a computer kind of like a perfect droplet environment without the AC, or are these like totally separate things to you?
No, they can be linked. They can be linked. And for example, so giving you an example of what I can be sure, I showed you the work of Shinpei. In the work of Shinpei, they tried to totally reprogram the behavior of the droplets, and with few droplets, they were able to do it and to reprogram it. And the software simulation was totally able to predict the behavior of the droplets. But so that's one example. But in the more the system goes complex and goes similar to real life and to nature, the more it becomes difficult. I hope that if you have another question, go on. Sam, yeah, I can search for it later and send it to you.
Awesome. Do you want to take? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Do you want to just take Igor's question, and then we should probably move on?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's difficult to make a definition of. I think in this topic it's really difficult to make definition, a definition of border between what is life, what is not life anymore, what is that exact predicted behavior, how it could change, and this kind of thing. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you again so much, Silvia. Fantastic talk, really great discussion afterwards. I really appreciated it. Next up, we have my talk on artificial ecologies. And let me just pull that up. I pre-recorded it, so I will be able to answer questions while it goes. I just need to actually share it. Hi everyone, my name is Emily Dolson, and I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University, and I'm really excited to be here talking to you today about artificial ecologies. So artificial ecologies are really kind of a broad cross-cutting theme within artificial life. They touch on a lot of different facets of it, and I kind of made this one of the topics of the summer school as a way to sneak in a bunch of different subfields of A-life. So to understand what artificial ecologies are, we should start out by understanding what non-artificial ecology is. According to dictionary.com, ecology is the branch of biology that deals with organisms' relations to each other and possibly their physical surroundings. So fundamentally, ecology is all about interactions. And in biology, there's kind of a split between ecosystem ecologists, who focus on the interactions between organisms and their abiotic environment, and community ecologists, who focus on the interactions between organisms and other organisms. So ecosystem ecologists tend to be really focused on nutrient cycling, like the nitrogen cycle or the carbon cycle, whereas community ecologists tend to be focused on things like competition, predation, food webs, mutualism, all those kind of interactions between different types of organisms that could exist. And in principle, we could have both of these types of ecology in artificial life, and to some extent we do. But at this point, I would say that in general, there's a pretty strong emphasis on community ecology over ecosystem ecology, possibly just because kind of the interactions between types of species feel more like they might generalize. Okay, so that's what ecology is in biology. What is ecology in artificial life? Well, it's mostly the same thing. The big difference is that either the species or genotypes or phenotypes or whatever is composing the ecological community are generally something artificial, or else the community itself is something that has been artificially constructed. And the reason that ecology is really important in artificial life is that ecological interactions are one of the big things that make biological systems act in ways that we think of as lifelike. And so when we try to think about instantiating lifelike systems outside of traditional biology, a lot of the kind of dynamics and behaviors that we're most interested in seeing are the ones that are associated with ecology. This is similar to the reason that evolution is so commonly studied in artificial life. These are two of the main organizing processes behind collections of living things. Okay, so why do we study ecology in artificial life? Well, there are a few reasons. One of the biggest ones is to be able to better understand or even predict what will happen in ecological communities in nature or in other biological contexts. These can often be very challenging problems to untangle in nature or even in the lab, because measuring the interactions between different types of individuals can be very challenging and sometimes even impossible. And so having artificial systems to do it in is a very powerful tool for biologists that are seeking to better understand these dynamics and how they apply to biology. On the flip side, there's also a line of research in artificial ecologies that's focused on using artificial life as a tool to create ecologies that do things that we want them to. And often the big challenge here is being able to make ecologies that are stable enough that they will continue doing whatever thing we design them to do. There are a lot of ecological communities in nature that we as humans rely on. And so working on how to create stable versions of those that will do the same things that we need can be really valuable. And on top of that, we can potentially build new ecological communities that will do even more useful things for us, perhaps above and beyond what we can do by engineering a specific species. And the other reason that we study ecology a lot in artificial life is that a lot of people who are studying A-life are interested in understanding complex systems in general. And ecological interactions are kind of one of the fundamental dynamics that can make a system behave in a complex way, where there's a lot of constituent parts that we could understand. We can understand how they interact with each other, but the overarching behavior of the system can still be hard to predict because of the nonlinear interactions between the individuals, or just unexpected emergent effects of the simple rules that govern the interactions between these individuals. So it's a very fertile ground for complexity theory as well. Okay, so now that we've talked about what artificial ecologies are and why you might care and how you might study them, let's talk about some specific examples of research on artificial ecologies that have happened in the A-life community so far. So like I said, this kind of spans all facets of A-life. So I'm going to walk through the soft, hard, and wet subsets of A-life. And let's start with soft. When we think about soft artificial life, so, artificial life that takes place in a computer, we can often think about the systems that we might study it in as falling along a sort of continuum, where on one extreme, we've got relatively simple and very targeted systems. And by targeted, I mean they're usually targeted very much at a specific question. Or in the case of ecology, they're often targeted at actually a specific ecosystem in nature that they're being used to try to understand. And at the other extreme, we've got very complex systems. And these systems tend to be used not to understand, this population of fish in this river, but instead to get at kind of general questions about hey, what happens if you have two populations that are competing with each other and they've got some of these characteristics? And both of these are very valuable, and both of them are part of artificial life. The group of people that are studying kind of the systems on the simpler end tend to kind of exist at an intersection between artificial life and standard ecological modeling. You could make an argument that actually most ecological modeling could be considered a form of artificial life, but most of those people don't think of themselves as studying artificial life. But regardless, there's plenty of artificial life done on these more targeted systems. As we move up to the more complex systems, there's also been a lot done, although interestingly, it's pretty much all been in the context of evolution, and that doesn't need to be true. I personally study eco-evolutionary dynamics, so I certainly like mixing ecology and evolution, but there's also a lot of fruitful questions that we could be asking about pure ecology. But regardless, in these more complex artificial life systems, we've addressed questions such as, how do ecological communities emerge? What pressures are sufficient to produce them? And what are the effects of having certain kinds of ecological communities? Do they facilitate evolution in certain directions or their behaviors? And these systems have included all kinds of ecological dynamics: predator-prey, mutualism, parasitism, competition. Really, the biggest challenge with studying a lot of these systems starts to be how complex they are. That at some point, it's not even that much better than trying to study nature, because there's just so much to untangle. And there are obviously still benefits to trying to untangle that in a digital system, because it is much more possible to make certain measurements and ask certain questions. But it still exists along the same continuum of trade-offs. Moving on from soft A-life to hard A-life, this is probably the subset of A-life with the least ecology, but it's not zero. Hard A-life, again, is robotics, basically. And there's actually been some really cool work done on robots that are kind of like hybrids between plants and machines. A particularly notable instance of this was the Flora Robotica project, where they were basically using robots to control where and how much plants grew by providing, for instance, light of different colors to very specific parts of different plants. And the idea is that you could use this to build kind of self-restoring walls, and all kinds of useful living architecture. And you could argue a bit about whether that counts as ecology, because it's technically just the plant. But I would say that in the same way that ecology can be interactions between organisms and their abiotic environment, I think in this case, regardless of whether you want to consider the robots part of the abiotic environment or another species that the plant is interacting with, I think we can call it ecology. And so this is a clear example of a situation where the goal is to use ecology to build something that is useful to us. And then lastly, we have wet A-life. This is probably the subset of A-life where artificial ecologies have been explored the most. So there's a whole field of synthetic ecology that overlaps pretty heavily with A-life. And there's a lot of different things going on in that field. So at one extreme, you've got ecologies of synthetic organisms. For instance, you could create a set of different types of protocells that all interact in a certain way, and that would be an artificial ecology. On the other extreme, you could just bring together a bunch of bacteria that would not usually live together, and that would also be an artificial ecology. Another completely different take on a wet artificial ecology is the idea of chemical ecologies. And so this is the idea that if you've got a bunch of chemicals in a soup together, they actually are in some sense forming an ecology, because based on the network of reactions that the chemicals can do with each other, certain chemicals will help facilitate the continued presence of other chemicals. And you start to get all of the same interactions that you get in ecology. Lastly, and I know this isn't one of the 3 official areas of A-life, but it's really cool, so I want to make sure to point it out, is speculative ecology. So art is explicitly a really important part of the field of artificial life, both because lifelike systems are this inherently beautiful thing that can be really powerfully channeled into art, but also because art can be a really powerful medium for kind of imagining how life could be, and what other kinds of lifelike systems could exist. And these artistic renderings can be a really powerful tool for thinking about future directions for the science side of artificial life to go in. I think one great example of this is Rachel Armstrong's work. She did a keynote a few years ago at A-Life, I think in Newcastle. And she had this gorgeous project called Future Venice, which was basically an imagining of what the city of Venice could look like in the future if we were to build a synthetic ecology to help fix some of its problems. And so two of the big problems that are facing Venice are the canals are very polluted, and also the canals are kind of wearing away some of the foundations of the cities. And so this art project was kind of multifaceted. First, it included some kind of synthetically engineered protocells that actually existed that would take some of the contaminants and the pollutants in the water out and turn them into these cool looking kind of crystalline structures. And then the other component was this purely speculative piece that imagined what would happen if you were to kind of put those protocells into the canals and build them into some sort of stable, self-perpetuating ecosystem where they could continue to exist. And the thought was perhaps this ecosystem could be constructed such that the kind of crystalline structures that they formed would actually reinforce the foundations of the buildings. And obviously there's a ton of science that needs to go into actually figuring out how to do that. But these kind of artistic renderings of what that could look like are a beautiful example of kind of the power of speculative artificial ecology for helping us just think about what the possibilities even are for the science that we could do. There is tons more cool artificial ecology, but I don't want to go over time. So thank you so much, and please feel free to ask any questions that you have. Okay, so I see some really great questions in the chat. I'm going to answer a couple of them, but then we're going to move on just in the interest of staying on time. So, right, Luis asks, identical genotypes competing over a single limiting nutrient. That's a great question. It's borderline. I think identical genotypes competing over a single limiting nutrient, like there is competition there. And that is definitely an interaction. I feel like, yeah, I don't tend to think of intraspecific interactions as much, but I think it's wrong to say that they're not ecology. I was just reading an article about how like variation within a population is still really an important part of ecology. Plus, like, then you have to like debate about what's really identical and what isn't. So yeah, I guess maybe it is an ecology. Okay, recommendation for a review article on artificial ecologies, maybe one that I wrote. Okay, so I definitely don't have a review article on the entire field of artificial ecologies, because like I said at the beginning, I kind of lumped a few fields together there a little bit to make it fit into one talk. I am about to have a review article on the digital ecology side, and I can post a link to where that will be once it comes out. Okay, and then, ooh, yeah, really like Sharon's comment about the ecology of fields. Totally agree about that. Cool, okay, yeah. Awesome, thank you for all the comments. And yeah, I'll be happy to take more questions in the discussion time at the end, but for now, I think we should probably move on to Alex Penn, who will be talking about A-Life for Social Good.
Okay. You hear me okay?
Yeah, thanks.
Right, let me share my screen. Okay, hold on. I need to make sure I wanted to put it in presenter view first, I think. Sorry I didn't pre-record this, guys. It's a slightly hectic time getting ready for the conference. Okay, presenter view. Okay. So, tell me what you can see. Can you see my presenter view or my normal?
We can see the presenter view.
What can you see now? Still the presenter view?
Oh, I guess before it was actually not even presenter view. Now it's presenter view.
Okay, well, I don't, yeah, let's just try and do it without the presenter view, I guess. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay. Still seeing presenter view?
Yeah.
Okay. We might just have to go with the presenter view, which you see the secrets behind the,
Foreshadowing.
yeah.
I think if you try again, there's like a button to swap the displays once you're like presenting that might do the trick.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So you can see my, so can you, swap displays? Can you,
Perfect.
yay, thank you. Wow, that's great. I've learned something new today. Okay. Right, thanks for that. Okay, so I'm Alex Penn, and I'm here to talk to you today about A Life for Society. And I'm not going to really go into depth about the research. It's more kind of a call to try and get you to join A Life in Society. I'm the ISAL Societal Impact Chair, but I'm an A-lifer by background and training, working originally on evolutionary biology and major transitions. But for the last 10 years or so, I've been working in the real world, building models with people of how to manage and make decisions in their complex social systems. And for the last 5 years, doing that with the UK government. Okay, so what is A Life for Society? Well, this is a movement that sort of started over 10 years ago at the conference, really, with the A Life and Society special session. It was kind of in a lull for a few years, but we relaunched at Cancun in 2016, where the conference was themed around societal challenges. And I think really the moment was really there when people wanted to get engaged with these challenges. Everyone felt it's something we want to do. So we've been kind of growing ever since then. We've been having these sessions at the conferences. So we're really a community, like a group of people in A Life and from disciplines outside A Life as well, who've got all sorts of different interests within the field, but we're all united by really a desire to help address real world challenges and to think about what A Life can specifically offer. So we don't have a definitive answer, and we don't think there's going to be one single answer. And we're very much kind of learning and developing movement. Okay, so why should we be thinking about A Life for Society? Well, I think we all know that there are many large-scale pressing societal challenges that we are facing at the moment, urgent challenges. So obviously climate change, social inequality, habitat destruction, global pandemics. And, you know, we want to have an impact here. We want to do what we can. But a lot of these challenges, you know, seem to be challenges about managing complex adaptive systems. So it's very difficult to make decisions and make policy in these complex systems. We've got ecosystems, economies, societies, systems, you know, interconnections between all of these things. And I think we all know that these are characterized by unexpected indirect effects, emergent properties, adapting and changing systems that change the rule of the game as you play it. So it's very difficult to make decisions about how to intervene with these systems in a way that's going to have the outcomes that we want. It's difficult for policy. And we're kind of thinking, well, you know, we know something about complex adaptive systems, so maybe we could help here. But these problems, when you come into real world policy domains, they have extremely complicated structure. So this is a systems map, a map of elements and causal connections of a public health problem of obesity. This is done by the UK government's Foresight team. And you can see in the center, you have the sort of classic energy balance, metabolism model of obesity. But I know you can't kind of see what's on the factors here, but actually, if you look closer at what's involved in these systems, there are all sorts of large scale social issues. There's things like more women working, and so people having more kind of takeaway food or pre-processed food. There's planning policy, which makes a difference to how streets are laid out and whether people can easily have active travel or whether there's money put into public transport. There's social change, like fewer people smoking, and so people tend to eat more when they stop smoking. This system is huge. There's no one person who has control over all this system, no one authority. It's distributed across domains of responsibility, and it's very difficult to see who or how we could intervene in a system like this to kind of make the policy changes that we want to do. So we've got these very big complex systems. And on top of that, to make things kind of even more interesting, like all of the systems we want to deal with are profoundly social. And this makes an enormous difference because, you know, people are embedded in these systems, their behavior changes how the systems behave, and that feeds back to them. And they reflect on the system and change their behavior according to that. But kind of most importantly of all, this means that these systems are what we call normative. People in the systems have different values and they want different things. So that means that there's no such thing as a kind of single optimum solution to a problem here, because people want different things, you know, and we hopefully want to live in a kind of democratic environment. So we're actually in the domain not just of complex systems problems, but what planners and social scientists call wicked problems. So these are problems that are characterized by multiple interactions, often trade-offs between key interests that people have. So if you think about climate change, food production, energy production, and say economic equity, you can immediately start to see there's trade-offs in here. It's difficult to find something that works for everyone. These problems can't be definitively described. There's no optimal solution, there's no stopping point, they change all the time. And, you know, the most important thing is there's no optimal solution. There's no definitive answer. You can only do better or worse for a particular group of people or an ecosystem. So we don't have a definitive answer to aim for. Okay, so it's quite a difficult sort of realm to work in. So our question is, or our task is to sort of think about what A-Life can uniquely offer, because there's obviously lots of people doing complexity science, ecology, lots of related disciplines working on this effort. So there've been already quite a few kind of ideas put forward on the sorts of unique contribution that A-Life can make. So, for example, Seth Bullock has talked about A-Life as maybe being a model discipline for working in theoretically insecure domains, so that we're used to kind of dealing with systems or ideas in which there isn't solid theory. We're kind of working with exploratory models to think about how systems might behave and to use models to generate theory. And in fact, a lot of the problems that policymakers work with, they are also in these domains where there is no established theory and they're having to make decisions in those situations. So maybe we could contribute to a better science policy interface in which we use models to actually kind of explore theory and to think about what might happen. That's a new kind of modeling from what government departments normally do. Mark Wadow has talked a lot about how policy systems themselves should be thought of as complex adaptive systems and what that means for working with them. So obviously it's difficult to predict what they'll do in advance, and they're constantly adapting and changing. We have to accept unpredictability. So this kind of perspective on systems is shared with systems approaches, systems design, resilience approaches, adaptive management specifically. But maybe as A-Lifers, we can contribute some new tools to those kind of domains that think about this kind of interaction with systems as a goal. Of course, lots of people in A-Life work on living technologies and cognitive technologies. I've got Steen up here, who's been a real, obviously, pioneer in the living technologies domain, but our hosts at this conference also, real pioneers in this domain. So there's building the technologies, but also looking at the societal and political implications of the bio, info, nano, cognitive, I think I've got that acronym right, technologies that people like Steen are looking at. So another kind of contribution we can think about, and I think Emily touched on this a bit in her talk, is like actually new systems and potentially some of the systems we have to deal with they might actually be, could be thought of as new hybrid living or lifelike systems at higher levels. I mean, would it be interesting to think about our cities or our agriculture, in this sense, as artificial life in some sense? And there's a number of people who kind of, I've put in this basket as coming from this perspective. So the guys at Alternative Machine, like Mizuki Oka and Yuta Akai, and a big long list of people who are there as well, thinking about how the boundaries of the self might be expanded by technology and the sort of ethical, philosophical, and legal implications of that. That's Dave Ackley's work. And then something that, I'm very involved with is with these kinds of new systems. How do we create ongoing interactions with these sorts of complex adaptive systems at higher levels, and participatory steering of those systems? So creating these interactions, and that's something that I work on also with Jesus Segueras. So there's loads more people there, but these were kind of some of the starting points. Someone who's been doing a lot here is also, of course, Hiroki Sayama, pointing out how we can use our modeling skills as A-lifers. So we're naturally interdisciplinary and we have great modeling skills. That's enormously useful in these sorts of situations, and it has been very useful over the course of the pandemic. So, but we have a lot to learn, I think. Many people in A-life and in all sorts of fields have a lot to learn about actually making models useful in real world contexts. So I encourage you all to come to our session, A-Life and Society 2. Come to all of our sessions, but A-Life and Society 2 tomorrow will be looking specifically at having people who have worked on COVID modelling during the last year or so, and the lessons that we've learned about real world modelling, for urgent societal challenges. So there's a lot for us to pull from there. So we can obviously model, and there's all those ideas I presented before that people have been thinking about. But I really think that, A-Life can do more. So A-Life is really focused on dealing with open systems, with big, undescribed open systems that surprise you all the time. And I'm not going to go into detail on this stuff, but I think you really see that from, say, looking at the evolvable hardware experiments where Adrian Thompson's FPGAs were co-opting properties of the computers around them in the lab to generate oscillators, and the kinds of work that Takashi does, where we're really about creating a large-scale open system and interacting with it. So, all real-world wicked problems are these kinds of open systems, but there's a real desire kind of in policy to have control, prediction, to have these closed models where we can say exactly what's going to happen. It never works, but, people kind of like to hang on to that. So I think we can kind of come in here with that perspective. And I also think, again, with this kind of creation of new living systems, either that we are creating or that are just have been created already, by the Anthropocene, that some of our perspectives could be helpful here in the Anthropocene with looking at new levels of living system. Okay, and I just want to, I'm probably massively over time already, but no, not quite yet. I just want to go through quickly, and I know this might be a bit controversial, but I think it's really important that we say what we think A-Life and Society should not be. Like, not everyone obviously agrees with me on this, but what it shouldn't be is kind of ill thought out techno fixes where we're just thinking, oh, that's kind of cool. We could build a robot here. So I think a really nice example of that is this kind of increasing idea of using robotic bees to deal with the problem of bee population collapse and issues around pollination of crops. So the idea that robot bees could replace bees. So I think it's really worth going to this paper. There's a great review here on like why this is a really bad idea by Potts et al. In Science of the Total Environment. But to summarize, really, we're very far from being able to kind of address this issue with robots. We don't really have things that work outside the lab. In reality, there are thousands and thousands of different species of pollinators specialized to different plants, not just like this kind of one size fits all silver bullet. If you do the back of the envelope costing, you find this is super, super expensive. And it may cause environmental damage. We don't know yet, what the waste issues would be, how these bees would interact with other ecosystems. And it has a clear sort of potential to erode the value of biodiversity. So this could actually be a bigger problem, than it solves. And I think it's really important that when we're thinking about challenges in the real world, that we are first and foremost thinking about the challenge, not our preferred solution, right? So not everything is a nail if we've got a hammer. If we need to look for pragmatic and effective approaches that take into account the whole system. So here that is putting in habitat for insect pollinators, diverse insect pollinators. And the science of ecology has got a lot to say about this. We know how to do this, right? It's cheap, it's effective, but the barriers are social, political, economic, supporting farmers to do this. That's what is difficult in the real world. We don't avoid that by kind of getting some robots in. So we really have to look at the whole system and work out where the barriers and blockages are and what we can do to make the solutions we've got work. And we need to think about all of the functions of what we're putting in. Our technologies are not going to be in a vacuum if they're in the real world. The other thing we shouldn't be, which is, I think A-Life is particularly good at compared to other models, is we shouldn't be doing closed world building with our models. So, you know, I thought this was kind of an interesting quote that I pulled out of the intersection here. But modeling can often be about closed world building and kind of encouraging us to look in. And what we really need at this moment is people who can code and are comfortable with maths and coding, but who also know history, sociology, psychology, and are comfortable with really thinking flexibly and analyzing complex and open systems. I think we're really well set up to do this, but we need to challenge ourselves by connecting to reality, like I'm trying to do this in the real world. So just to wrap up, I think for me, there are some like important guidelines for working on real world challenges if you want to have genuine societal impacts, okay? So work where it's effective, like understand what the system looks like, the whole system, and then think about where it might be effective to intervene and where there is power to intervene. Start from like the here and now where we are in reality. Crucially, it's about being humble. You know, we're not expert superheroes kind of coming in to save the day. We need to collaborate, communicate, learn with all the people who are, you know, experts in the system, like the farmers on the ground, like the politicians, like the people in these systems. And everyone can learn collaboratively together. You know, we shouldn't be thinking of ourselves, you know, as I say, as the superheroes. Never underestimate the social world, like the real barriers are often social or political or economic. So, you know, if we really want to make things happen in the real world, we have to think about that. A kind of aspect of that, I think, is really be aware of like the kind of lure of artificial worlds, or the illusion of control that models can give to, say, policymakers or other people trying to solve these problems. I think you've got to be very, very careful, because people are really often looking to get away from the complexity, to throw away the kind of difficult and messy nature of reality. So we have to use our models in a way that helps people explore and take them further and gets their thinking about complexity going further and gets them more comfortable with these open and unpredictable systems, not in ways that makes them think they just press a red button and the problem is solved. That's not what we can do with models. So we're going to be always interacting with systems that are going to be changing and new problems are arising. We're not solving problems. You know, I think in these wicked problem situations, that's really, really crucial. And yeah, again, like just always ask when you're doing something, who does this work for? And who is this disadvantaging? Like, is this actually going to wipe out someone's livelihood? Is this actually increasing economic inequality? Like, is it something that's a great solution if you're middle class and can spend some money on a gadget, or is this something that's really addressing a broad societal challenge? And yeah, I guess like really ultimately it's great to innovate ideas. You know, I really like doing it myself, but at the moment we have these urgent challenges to address, and I think we're in a situation where the gap is in application and not in new ideas. There's lots and lots of ideas out there, including our own. And we really need to carry things through. We really need to start developing and embedding our ideas and trying them out in the real world. So please, you know, come and join us and get involved in this initiative. We've got a lot of sessions this conference. Most of them are all on Tuesday. But so we've got the A-Life and Society special sessions 1 and 2, or on Tuesday the 20th. And then in the middle of those two sessions, we've got the Robots for Good workshop, which is a special edition of sort of A Life for Good workshops. And that's going to be a session where we've got invited guests from different external fields who are presenting their challenges. And we're going to try doing some work together to understand their challenges and think about how A Life might connect, and to come up with some seed project ideas, which we'll take forward. And then we've got a big joint discussion session with A Life and Society and A Life for Good on Wednesday, the 21st, where we'll really be kind of thinking about all of the big issues that have come up from the conference, discussing how to take things further and kind of taking forward some project ideas. So please come along to all of these. You can always publish papers in the A Life, the journal, societal impact section. But mostly what I want to say is we'd really love you to join the A Life for Society community, which is a really great group of people growing all the time. Everyone is really welcome. We meet kind of every fortnight, and we're just putting forward ideas, having little seminars, trying to come up with working projects, and really trying to take A Life for Society forward. And it's a great group to be part of. So that you can see our website at the bottom there, which has been brilliantly put together by Imi Khan, who is there in a kind of giant long picture on the right hand side, so I didn't chop his hair off. There's lots of, just come along. It's a lovely group, and we'd love to have you, because this initiative needs all of us. Like, A Life for Society is about all of us. So please join us. Thank you.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Alex.
You're welcome.
I always love hearing about this because this stuff is so important. I think we've got time for some questions.
Okay. Any, do you want to pick any out? I'm kind of scrolling through the chat. Or does anyone want to say something?
I guess I've got a question.
Yeah.
So like when you're dealing with these wicked problems, I mean, this might not be a question you have an answer to, but like, have you like come up with ways to kind of figure out where you can get like a foothold on them, and like where you might be able to find a point that you could meaningfully change?
Yeah, so I mean, the kind of method that we use when we do, so I've done a lot of work in government with sort of systems mapping, and I didn't talk about it because I think everyone has probably heard me talk about that 6,000 times before. But we build these collect models of the system with the people involved. So, for example, with policymakers or stakeholders on the ground, and we think about everything that's important in the system and how it's interconnected, and kind of crucially, what are the important functions or outcomes of the system. And then we do what I call a sort of subjective network analysis as a first approach. So, for example, we collect information on what things in the system you have influence over and what things different groups have influence over. So you can pull out, by kind of combining just sort of centrality analysis with this kind of objective, subjective information on factors, you can find factors that are, say, very influential on things that matter to people. So they're not just, say, like a highly central, hypertweenous centrality, but they bridge things that matter, or interventions in the system, factors that you can control that are high out degree, but that the out degree is kind of weighted by how many meaningful things it influences. So we're trying to we pull out these kind of suggested points of intervention and levers by doing that sort of thing. But in a way, that's just the kind of prompt to help people get started talking about it. And I think we also sort of pull out things, for example, in this domain where that kind of help people think about their problems. That's one of the most important things we do, actually. We help them sort of reframe and reconceptualize their problems and talk to each other. So I think one of the most impactful things that we did in some of our work was we showed that policy of digital connectivity in a big agricultural policy system was really, really crucial for lots of the policy outcomes. And this is how they were intending to deliver many of those policy outcomes. But actually, the Agriculture Department, DEFRA, was not in control of that policy at all. It was the Treasury. And so they were then able to think, oh, you know, this is a problem for us. So that actually, they redesigned their policy delivery to buffer against that. So they made everything possible to do offline. So in a way, we're kind of like finding these kind of points where it's useful to change things. But I always think about what we're doing is helping the people on the ground, giving them sort of thinking tools rather than saying definitively. Yeah. You can see why I don't like do a talk on this, because I just go on about it for 3 hours or something. But anyone else want to ask anything?
Looks like Mizuki has a question in chat.
Okay, what is the A-life will be important for the coexistence of robots and humans. Have you had any discussion about that in A-life and society? You know, so interestingly, we haven't as yet talked about that, but in the Robots for Goods workshop, which would be great if you wanted to come to, we will have a kind of challenge theme on the ethical challenges of automation in Japan in replacing the workforce. So I think that sort of thing could come up there. If you'd like to kind of come and join us and like start to talk about that, I think that would be great. So yeah, it's all there ready to work with.
Awesome. Looks like we've got a question from Alberto too, also about ethics.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Are there ethical guidelines to A-life? And I think, you know, I think that's probably something really worth us thinking about. I mean, in some sense, there are ethical guidelines to thinking about synthetic biology or synthetic ecology, or people working to create them. There've been people thinking about putting robots in ecosystems. Alan Doran's got a great paper, which is going to be in the A-Life and Society session 1 on ethical guidelines for interacting with ecosystems. But yeah, I think it's a diverse field in a way, so it's maybe quite difficult for us to sort of think, are there a set of guidelines that cover everything? So yeah, I think I would say it would probably have to be dependent on like what you're talking about, but we could be drawing on what's there in AI, what's there in synthetic biology, and you know, and other kind of bioethics fields and informatics ethics. So yeah, maybe worth doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Okay, it looks like there aren't any more questions in the chat right now. So we've got in the schedule now is general discussion. And so that can go as long as people want. So yeah, I guess we'll just open it up to any questions about any topics that we discussed today.
Okay, I'm going to have to head off, guys, but thank you for that. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Alex.
See you later.
Or if people are tired, that's okay too. It's been a lot of talks.
So I know there was a question earlier about how people who were kind of come from artificial life background get into AI. What about the other way? So I know it's a little bit more difficult, but my background is more AI, specifically like deep learning. But I find this stuff extremely fascinating and would love to get my hands on a little bit more. So if anyone has thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great question. My background is not AI. So if someone who has an AI background has an answer, they'd probably be better. Otherwise, I could take a stab.
I would say that there are a lot of deep learning papers now that are starting to wade into the A-life waters, as it were. So maybe those kinds of papers would be good for you to check out. I can post a couple in chat while we're having this discussion. They're going to be heavily biased towards robotics and things that I read, but they might be a good place to start.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, the other thing I would think is just that in general, I think there's a lot of power in like hooking up like different AI models to controlling agents in an A-life system. And I mean, I think like figuring out what your goal with that is the challenge at that point. But I think there's lots of cool things you can do.
Yeah, I know one of my, I guess, entry points to this kind of area was actually some of this neurocellular automata stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what kind of got me looking into more of this stuff, which is sort of a combo of some of these things.
Awesome. Anyone else have thoughts or other questions they'd like to discuss? Okay, it looks like Anya has a question from a student. What are some examples that evolutionary robotics are used for? We'll say, I imagine you're best able to answer this.
Maybe. Let me think. So some examples of like how evolutionary robotics have actually been useful in the real world are few and far between. I think most of the examples have been proofs of concepts and kind of basic science showing these things are possible. It's possible to automate the design of robots or technologies or even software systems that are related to robots. And they come up with solutions that are different from or complement human designers. Concrete examples, now I don't know if you call this a robot, but one of the classic ones from just evolutionary design is like Greg Hornby's antenna, evolved antenna that could pick up, and there are other people on the paper, I'm just forget the other authors, evolved shapes of antennas that actually went on one of those tiny CubeSat NASA satellites, and they can pick up like strange radiation patterns that existing antennas don't pick up as well. So that's an example of something, a physical artifact that was made that was actually better in some ways than a human designed system. But most robots are human designed for now. I'll try to think during this conversation now if I can think of other examples, but simple ones for now.
What about that hexapod behavior thing that Jeff Clune and others did? Like that seemed like it might be an advance on the state of the art that was achieved through evolution. I don't know like what the status of actually using it in the real world is.
Oh, totally. There have been papers that definitely are closer towards application, like adapting to damage very quickly, like in that paper. And there's a new paper out in RSS, Robotic Science and Systems, last week from Deepak Pathak's group at Carnegie Mellon that were taking robots and training them in simulation, putting them in crazy new environments, and they adapted in like a second, which seems, not a second, nanoseconds, or like instantly, which seems like it would be really useful. But yeah, this reality gap isn't just from simulation to reality, it's also from these lab environments to the real world with wind and AC and other things. So it's hard to say if and when they'll be useful. I think you see lots of demos and stuff with Boston Dynamics. The robots look great. Those are controlled with remote controls. So when are we going to have autonomous robots that are actually performing useful work that we feel ethically and like is okay to put in the environment? I don't know. I think that they could be useful, but yeah, I don't have a good example yet, which is why you should join Evolution Robotics. You should be the first one.
Is there a big difference, or is there a clear line you can, and it's probably, the answer is probably no, between evolutionary robotics and more like engineering of these biological cells, like engineering a cell to do something, you know?
Yeah, I don't think so. I consider myself a roboticist, just that's building with living tissues instead of plastics and servo motors and whatever. And in some ways, there are opportunities there, and there's also challenges to get living stuff to do what you want. But when you can, you get a lot of things for free from living materials. They naturally are homeostatic and heal themselves. So there's pros and cons to building a titanium robot versus a soft one made out of silicone versus a one made out of frog cells. I don't know, again, if any of those are going to be useful, any evolved ones will be useful, but they definitely help us understand, I think, the basic principles of adaptive behavior, which I hope will become useful in future robotic technologies, whether those are hand designed or evolved.
Do you think that like the gap in like bringing things into the real world from A-Life and evolutionary robotics, is it all exacerbated by like, I feel like in general, A-Life doesn't have like a commercial bent. Like, do you think that's a hindrance?
Personally, I love A-Life. It's my favorite conference, and whatever the whatever the strategy is of A-Life, I would say let's stick with it. It's good to have, I guess, people that are more focused on applications. It's good to have diversity in what people are interested in. Yes, that's probably, maybe that's holding back some applications. But let's stay weird. Stay
Yeah, I'm
A-Life-y.
with you on that.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a question about that. So, where does all of the funding come from? This kind come from to this kind of field? Like, is it mostly government funding? Yeah.
I think it varies based on the different branches and like even like individual aims within branches. Like definitely, I haven't gotten funding yet, but my goal, my target funding sources are pretty much all NSF, maybe some NIH. So, but yeah, all government, because I'm basically framing what I do when I'm applying for funding as kind of basic science, where the goal is to better understand biological processes, specifically evolution and ecology, so that we can, you know, achieve other goals farther down the road. But I imagine that's a lot different for people who are doing robotics, for instance.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah, Anya has a good point about there also being private foundations that are interested in some of these questions. And definitely, like, I know people who have partnered with companies and stuff. Like, there was a lab at MSU that was working with a video game studio, and they were like generating cool, like procedurally generated stuff for video games using evolution. And that was like funding some of their A-Life work.
Oh, that's cool. It's I guess it's much more of a kind of art application, which is really cool actually. You have
Yeah,
the plus art, and it's a real world application.
yeah, it's awesome. Other comments, questions, concerns? Oh yeah, Anya is saying we could dive some more into ethics. Yeah, no, and that's also definitely, I think, something that like Mark would have covered in the intro talk that I did not, because I do not have that background. I mean, ethics are very important to me. I just haven't made a study of them. Yeah, I mean, Anya, did you have thoughts on the ethical side? Mm.
I think it all depends even on the definition and then the border that we place between life and non-life. Mainly even from the biological point.
You mean because we generally have certain ideas about what it's okay to do to life versus to non-life?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's a good point, Anya. No one does really care what we do to E. coli.
Yeah, so there, I'm not an expert on ethics at all. I'm trying to read more about it and think more deeply about it during, the projects that I'm doing and in the beginning before I enter into some of these projects. There's robot ethics about people, about robots doing jobs that otherwise would go to people. In Western societies, normally, if there's an economic benefit to something happening, it's going to happen regardless of what we say about it. So I think we might need to think about ways of dealing with it. And I don't have solutions, but I think it's going to happen. So we need to think about it and solutions to these problems. With the biologicals that we're building, it's something that I think very deeply about and worry about. And there have been examples of biohybrid robots, which take rat heart muscle cells as actuators and embed them in a silicone scaffold. And using these, they can pulse and move and swim and do different things. The ethics on those, I think, are challenging. There's certainly reasons why you'd want to do that and investigate mammalian cells, and labs deal with rats already, so they maybe had them at hand. But in the methods, there are animals that are sacrificed to get those cells, and it's, as a computer scientist, I'm like, how do biologists do science like this? How do they decide that's worth it? It's really difficult for me if I was in charge of making those decisions. What I like about the project I'm involved with is just taking frog eggs. Like there's just, you can get hundreds of thousands of frog eggs. And if they're just a day old, they're not tadpoles yet. There's no neurons in there. They're just undifferentiated stem cells. They are fertilized. There's potential for them to become something. That's also should be taken into consideration. But the mom frog normally eats most of them. They aren't going to survive in the real world, most of them. So I think taking a couple and making some simple, like silly A-life agents out of them, for me, like that's okay. But everyone has their own moral calculus. And I think maybe if you were really strict vegan, you might think that that's not okay. And everyone has the right to their opinion, and we should hear them out. But I will say that biological work, unlike robotics work, for good reason, has like strict ethical standards. There's federal guidelines, there's state guidelines, there's university and institution guidelines. And yeah, they involve flushing them down the drain, and also what you can do, and also suffering of animals. And they're not perfect guidelines. So I just went through this training as pretending to be a biologist now. I had to do all the training before I dealt with the frog eggs. And the guidelines are like, there's all these regulations for animal research, unless you're going to eat the animal, then do whatever. Then you can eat, not in a lab, but if it's covered under the FDA, which some species are, they're like, you can't do this, this, or this. You have to go through all this regulation. But if it's for eating, then whatever. And I'm like, wait, that's a huge disconnect. What are we doing here? Like, so I think we need to think more about ethics for sure. And I'm trying to do that. I think we all should.
Thanks. That's really interesting. Yeah, it reminds me of this person that used to be at MSU who studied fetal chickens. And he was required to kill them before the embryos developed to a certain point because they'd become vertebrates. And so he had to, like, in order to qualify as working with non-vertebrates, kill them.
I know that I worked at a basically a neuroscience research facility, Genelia, and basically had these big robots that deal with the rats, and because they use them to study their brains. And so I think they've kind of automated and pushed away interacting with a lot of the animals, so they don't have to deal with the messy stuff. You know, so I wonder how much that impacts the kind of the psychology of doing you know, the research and experimentation if you don't have to even deal with the you know, the more questionable parts of it. I assume that kind of automation will happen more and more in especially the bigger research facilities.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I think that transparency is really important. You bring up a good point. I know some conferences made it mandatory to have an ethics statement in their papers. I like that idea. People were annoyed with it because they didn't want to just put a boilerplate thing. They made a piece of software and they, you know, they didn't really think about how their system specifically in a unique way would influence people or ecosystems. But I think it should be encouraged. Maybe I don't know if A-Life has ever done that, but we should do it.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. And like, I mean, even software systems, there can be huge ethical considerations, like all the machine learning that's like just hard coding biases that people already have against other groups of people. Clearly there are ethical issues there.
Yeah, there's been a lot of big controversies recently, especially I don't know if anyone has followed it, but the firing of Dr. Timmett from Google and all that fallout. So there's been a lot of big discussions in the deep learning spheres about ethics recently.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's a good point, Anya. The energy used to run experiments. Well, are there any final ideas, questions, comments? Should we wrap up? Cool. Okay. Yeah, we're just about at time. Thank you all so much for coming, for the great discussions, the presentations. Really appreciated it. It was great to have all of you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for giving talks. It was really informative. Hope everyone has a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Sylvia, is there any last stuff we need to do to wrap up? Or should we?
No, I'm starting to try to convert the video.
Mhm.
And I will update you. The only thing is that, so I'm not sure because in the middle I stopped it and before then starting my presentation, I restarted it. But normally when you stop it, it makes more files. I don't know why this time maybe it did only one. I don't like it, but I will update you and you always have even your recording that we can export and use. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's update.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.